So chapter 12, the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is composed of the heart, blood vessels, and blood. There are two circuits in the cardiovascular system. One circuit is called the pulmonary circuit, and the other one is called the systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit is the circuit between the heart and the lungs, and the systemic circuit is the circuit between the heart and the body. So this structure right here, right, that's the heart. This structure here and over here represents the lungs. These structures up here and down here represent the body. Specifically, one is going to represent the upper body, and the other one is going to represent the lower body. So the heart is located in a chamber called, in a cavity called the mediastinum. The mediastinum is a cavity found between the lungs. And the way the heart sits in the body is that it sits tilted to the left. So the apex is slightly tilted to the left. So here you have the apex right here, and you can see how the apex is tilted slightly to the left. Alright, so the function of the heart is to pump blood. It's not a no-brainer, right? Pump blood. And there's two types of blood it's going to pump. It's going to pump oxygen-rich blood and oxygen-poor blood. Right. Now specifically, each side of the heart controls what type of blood it pumps. So the right side of the heart pumps oxygen-poor blood, and the left side of the heart pumps oxygen-rich blood. Okay, membranes of the heart. Way back in chapter 1, you guys learned about different types of membranes. Right? The most common membrane is the serous membrane. The serous membrane is made up of several parts. And since we're talking about the heart, we're going to talk about the pericardial membrane, okay, or the pericardial serous membrane. So the first membrane is a membrane that actually touches the outer wall of the heart itself. We call this the visceral pericardium. Then you have an outer membrane that lines the cavity. We call this the parietal pericardium. And then you have the space in between. The space in between is called the pericardial cavity. And within this pericardial cavity, you have something called pericardial fluid. So pericardial fluid serves two functions. It serves as a shock absorber, and it helps reduce friction. So looking at external structures of the heart is composed of four chambers. The upper chambers are called atria. So you have a right atrium and you have a left atrium. And the two lower chambers are called ventricles. You have a right ventricle and you have a left ventricle. So looking at the heart from an internal view, again, right, you have the right atrium, you have the left atrium, you have the right ventricle, and you have the left ventricle. In between the chambers of the heart, you have divisions called septums. In between the right atrium and the left atrium is a division called the interatrial septum. In between the two ventricles, here's the right ventricle and the left ventricle, so in between the two ventricles is called the interventricular septum. So the interventricular septum is made up of a wall of myocardium. Myocardium is heart muscle. Next are the valves. All right, so there are two types of valves found in the human heart. One set of valves are called atrioventricular valves. And these valves are found between the atria and ventricles. Examples of atrioventricular valves are the tricuspid and the bicuspid, also called the mitral valve. The second type of valve are what we call semilunar valves. Semi meaning half, lunar refers to the moon. So the cusps of these valves represent half moon shape. Examples of semilunar valves would be the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve. So taking a look at the valves and labeling on the diagram, you have this one here is called the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve is found between the right atrium and the right ventricle. This valve here is the bicuspid valve. It's a valve found between the left atrium and left ventricle. Then you have this valve right here. This is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. And the pulmonary semilunar valve is found between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. And then the last valve found within the heart is this valve right here. It's called the aortic semilunar valve. And the aortic semilunar valve is found between the left ventricle and the aorta. So the way the valves work, especially the atrioventricular valves, the way that they function is that they need two things. You need these heartstrings here, called chordae tendineae, and these structures here, called papillary muscles. So as the name implies, a papillary muscle is going to contract. It's going to shorten in length when stimulated by an electrical impulse. Alright, so just to reiterate, valves, the function of a valve is to prevent blood from flowing backwards. So the major vessels that come off of the heart, right, are either going to transport blood to the heart or transport blood away from the heart. So a long time ago, back in your early days, you probably were told that arteries are vessels that carry oxygen-rich blood, and veins are blood vessels that carry oxygen-poor blood. That's a wrong definition. The actual definitions of arteries and veins: an artery is a blood vessel that carries blood away from the heart. Veins are blood vessels that carry blood to the heart, regardless of whether they're oxygenated or deoxygenated. 99% of the time, you guys can get away with oxygen-rich blood is in an artery, oxygen-poor blood is carried by a vein. The 1% of the time occurs in the heart. So that's why you'll never hear me or use those definitions of what carries what blood by oxygen-rich or oxygen-poor. All right, so looking at the major vessels of the heart, we're going to start with the major vessels that deliver oxygen-poor blood, okay, or transport oxygen-poor blood. So the first vessel is this vessel here and this vessel here, or these vessels. This is called the superior vena cava. This one here is called the inferior vena cava. The superior vena cava drains oxygen-poor blood from the head. The inferior vena cava drains oxygen-poor blood from the lower body. Both vena cava dump their oxygen-poor blood into the right atrium. The next major blood vessel that transports oxygen-poor blood is this guy right here. This is the pulmonary trunk. And the pulmonary trunk will split into a right and left branch, which we call the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. So oxygen-poor blood in the pulmonary arteries is delivered to the lungs, where it gets oxygenated. Oxygen-rich blood from the lungs returns back to the heart through these vessels here. One is called the left pulmonary vein, and the other one is the right pulmonary vein. And both pulmonary veins dump their oxygen-rich blood into the left atrium. So finally, the last major blood vessel that carries oxygen-rich blood is this vessel here. This is called the aorta. And there are three parts to the aorta. Okay. The first part is between the heart and the branches. So these are the branches. Okay, so the first part is this part right here. This is called the ascending aorta. The second part is where the branches exit the aorta. This part right here. This is called the aortic arch. And then the last part is after the arch, which is this piece right here. This is called the descending aorta. So the last thing that we're going to talk about today are the blood vessels. And there are three types of blood vessels. There are arteries, veins, and capillaries. Now each blood vessel has unique and distinct characteristics, which is what I'm going to show you. So when we look at an artery, a cross-section of an artery, the part that distinguishes the artery from all other blood vessels is the middle layer, called the tunica media. The tunica media is made up of smooth muscle. Arteries have a thick tunica media, and the reason why they have a thick layer of smooth muscle is to help resist blood pressure. When you look at a vein from a cross-sectional view, the tunica media is relatively thin, but what distinguishes a vein from all other vessels is that veins have structures within them called valves. And just like valves in the heart, valves in the veins prevent blood from flowing backwards. And the last type of blood vessel is the capillary. The capillary is one cell thick. It is made up of simple, squamous, epithelial tissue. So it's a single layer of flattened cells. That's what it's made up of. And the reason why capillaries are made up of simple squamous epithelial tissues is because capillaries are going to be involved with gas exchange. Right? It's going to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen at the tissue level.